February 14th, 1942. Bukit Timah, Singapore. The air hangs thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning rubber. British Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Percival stands in a command bunker, his uniform soaked through with sweat that has nothing to do with Singapore's tropical heat. In his hand, a message from London, typed on thin paper that trembles slightly as he reads it for the third time. 4 words that will condemn thousands of men to death or capture. Hold Singapore at all costs. Outside, Japanese artillery pounds the island's defenses. The 25th Army under General Tomoyuki Yamashita has swept down the Malayan Peninsula in 70 days, covering 650 miles through terrain the British High Command had declared impenetrable. Now 30,000 Japanese soldiers face 85,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops defending Singapore. The numbers favor the defenders. The reality does not. Because London has issued an order that military historians would later identify as one of the most catastrophic examples of inflexible defensive doctrine in World War II. Defend every position to the last man. Allow no retreat. Hold at all costs. This is the story of how a defensive rule, repeated across multiple theaters throughout World War II, transformed defensible retreats into massacres and turned tactical flexibility into a death sentence for tens of thousands of soldiers who could have lived to fight another day. If you're interested in the untold human stories of World War II, the decisions that changed lives and the doctrines that cost them, make sure to subscribe to Override War. We bring you a comprehensive, researched truth about the Second World War, not the sanitized versions, but the real, human, devastating truth. The origins of a deadly doctrine. To understand why hold at all costs became such a pervasive and deadly order, we have to go back to the opening phases of the war, to the retreats that traumatized every major power involved in the conflict. For the Germans, it was the memory of World War I's collapse, when retreat turned into rout, when armies disintegrated and revolution consumed the homeland. Adolf Hitler, who served as a corporal in that war, carried a pathological fear of retreat. In his mind, every step backward was a step toward total collapse. This worldview would crystallize in December 1941 when German armies froze outside Moscow. The Wehrmacht wanted to pull back to defensible winter positions. Hitler refused. He issued the first of many fortress orders: hold every village, every position, no retreat under any circumstances. In military terms, this order was insane. German soldiers were freezing to death in summer uniforms. Their vehicles wouldn't start. Their weapons seized up in negative 40-degree temperatures. Tactical retreats to fortified positions would have saved tens of thousands of lives and preserved combat effectiveness. But Hitler's order was absolute. Officers who suggested retreat were relieved of command. Some were shot. The message was clear. Death from enemy bullets was acceptable. Retreat was not. The cruel irony is that Hitler's stand-fast order outside Moscow might have actually prevented a complete collapse. The Wehrmacht was so disorganized, so exhausted, that an orderly retreat could have turned into a rout. By forcing units to hold in place, Hitler inadvertently stabilized the front. This accident of success would poison German defensive doctrine for the rest of the war. Every subsequent disaster, every encirclement, every annihilation of entire army groups would be preceded by a Führer order to hold at all costs. The Soviets learned the opposite lesson from the same experience. In summer 1941, German armies destroyed entire Soviet fronts through encirclement. Millions of Red Army soldiers marched into captivity because local commanders lacked authority to retreat. Stalin's response was not to grant more flexibility. It was Order Number 227, issued July 28, 1942, not one step back. The order established block-in detachments, NKVD troops positioned behind Soviet lines, with orders to shoot any soldier attempting to retreat. Commanders who withdrew without permission faced execution. Soldiers captured by the Germans, even if they later escaped, were treated as traitors. The British and Americans approached defensive doctrine differently, at least in theory. British military tradition emphasized tactical flexibility. Junior officers were expected to exercise initiative, but in practice, particularly in the Far East, British commanders issued the same inflexible stand-fast orders that German and Soviet commanders did. The difference was that British and American forces generally had better logistics, better communications, and more ability to actually evacuate when positions became untenable. Generally, but not always. Singapore, 1942. The Doctrine in Practice. Let's return to Singapore, February 1942, because this single battle illustrates every fatal flaw in rigid, defensive doctrine. The strategic situation was already hopeless by mid-February. The Japanese controlled the skies. They had destroyed or driven off the Royal Navy. They held the entire Malayan Peninsula. Singapore's water supply came from the mainland, through reservoirs now in Japanese hands. The island's military supplies, ammunition, food, and medicine had been calculated for a siege lasting months. But those calculations assumed the causeway connecting Singapore to the mainland would be destroyed, that the siege would be conducted from a distance. Instead, Japanese forces had captured the causeway intact and were across it before British engineers could properly demolish it. Any competent tactical analysis in February 1942 would have concluded that Singapore was indefensible. The island is low-lying, 27 miles east to west and 14 miles north to south. It has no natural defensive terrain. Its fortifications, the famous big guns that supposedly made Singapore impregnable, all faced seaward. They were designed to destroy an invading fleet, not to fight a land battle. When Japanese forces attacked from the north, through the Johor Strait, those guns were useless. Most couldn't even be rotated to fire inland. The ammunition stored for them was armor-piercing, designed to penetrate ship hulls, not high explosive for land combat. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival knew this. His staff officers knew this. Junior commanders knew this. But London's orders were explicit. Hold Singapore at all costs. The island was a symbol, the British Empire's primary military base in Southeast Asia. Its fall would be a devastating blow to British prestige. Churchill himself had insisted that Singapore must not fall. He believed the garrison of 85,000 men could hold indefinitely. He believed this despite every report from officers on the ground, explaining that the garrison, while large on paper, was actually a mixture of undertrained troops, raw recruits, and exhausted survivors from the Malayan campaign. Many units had never fired their weapons in combat. Some Indian Army battalions had been formed just weeks earlier and lacked basic cohesion. On February 8, 1942, Japanese forces began crossing the Johor Strait in earnest. They used collapsible boats, improvised rafts, anything that floated. British artillery pounded the crossing points, but without air support or adequate ammunition reserves, they couldn't stop the assault. By February 10th, Japanese forces had established a solid bridgehead on Singapore's northwest coast and were advancing toward the city. This was the moment when tactical retreat could have saved lives. The British garrison could have contracted to a tight perimeter around Singapore City itself, dug in, and forced the Japanese to mount a costly urban assault. This would have bought time for evacuation of civilians and non-essential personnel. It would have preserved the trained core of the Yai garrison for future operations. Instead, Percival followed his orders. Every position was to be held. Units scattered across the island's 276 square miles were told to defend in place. The result was predictable. Japanese forces, concentrated and mobile, defeated British units piecemeal. They cut the island into sectors, isolated garrisons, and overran them one by one. The stand-fast order meant that instead of facing a coherent defensive line, Japanese troops encountered scattered strongpoints that could be bypassed or reduced individually. British units that could have reinforced each other were instead trapped in static positions, waiting for an attack that would annihilate them. The trap closes February 11th to 15th, 1942. By February 11th, the water situation had become critical. The main reservoirs were either in Japanese hands or under direct artillery fire. Engineers estimated the city had water for perhaps one more week, less if fires from bombing and shelling continued. Medical supplies were running low. The hospitals overflowed with wounded, and still, the order was to hold every position. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Varley commanded a battalion of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, one of the few units that had remained cohesive during the Malayan campaign. On February 12th, his position on the western side of the island came under heavy attack. Varley radioed brigade headquarters, requesting permission to pull back to a better defensive position 800 yards to the east, a position with clear fields of fire and natural obstacles that would force the Japanese to attack across open ground. Permission denied. Hold your current position. Varley's battalion fought magnificently. They held for 14 hours against overwhelming odds. They inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Japanese forces, but they were eventually overrun because they had no fallback position, no secondary defensive line. When the final Japanese assault came, the Highlanders had nowhere to retreat to. Of 750 men in the battalion that morning, 320 were killed or captured in that single engagement. The survivors, barely 400 men, stumbled back toward the city center in small groups, their cohesion shattered. This pattern repeated across the island. At Bukit Timah, the Alexandra Hospital area, Pasir Panjang Ridge, officers requested permission to retreat to better positions. Permission was denied. Units fought until they were overrun, or until so few men remained that holding the position became physically impossible. Then they retreated anyway, but in disorder, having sacrificed their strength, defending positions of no tactical value. On February 13th, Percival received an estimate from his engineers. The water would last, at most, 48 hours. The city was filling with wounded, with refugees, with demoralized troops. Japanese artillery was systematically destroying what remained of the island's infrastructure. And still, London's orders remained. Hold at all costs. Major General Gordon Bennett, commanding the Australian forces, met with Percival on February the 14th. Bennett was a difficult man, abrasive and ambitious, but he understood what was happening. He told Percival that continued resistance was pointless, that they were sacrificing men for no tactical or strategic gain. The position was lost. Every hour they held cost hundreds of lives and achieved nothing. Percival agreed. He composed a message to London, explaining the situation and requesting permission to surrender. Churchill's response came back within hours. Continue fighting. Singapore must not fall. On the morning of February 15th, with water supplies exhausted and Japanese forces fighting in the city streets, Percival finally surrendered without London's permission. By that point, British casualties for the entire Malayan campaign had reached approximately 7,500 killed and 10,000 wounded. Another 80,000 men marched into captivity, where more than 15,000 would die in prisoner-of-war camps over the next 3 years. The strategic result of the Stand-Fast Order. Japan gained control of Southeast Asia's most important port weeks or months earlier than they would have if British forces had conducted fighting withdrawals. The human result, tens of thousands of additional casualties for no tactical benefit whatsoever. The human cost, stories from the Stand-Fast Order. Let's talk about the men who died because of these orders. Not statistics, but individuals. Private James McAllister, 19 years old, from Glasgow. He served in the 2nd Battalion Gordon Highlanders. On February 11th, his company held a position near the Bukit Tama Road. Japanese forces bypassed them during the night, cut them off from the rest of the battalion. McAllister's company commander requested permission to break out and rejoin the main line. Permission denied. Hold position. For 36 hours, 140 men held that position against probing attacks. They had no food. Their water ran out after the first day. When the Japanese launched a full assault on February 13th, the company was overrun in 20 minutes. McAllister died in that assault. His body was never recovered. He's listed on the Kranji War Memorial, one of 24,000 names commemorating men with no known grave. Captain William Hunt, Australian Army, 27 years old. He commanded a company defending the Alexandra area. On February 14th, Japanese forces broke through the line to his east. Hunt's position was now surrounded on 3 sides. He radioed battalion headquarters explaining that he could withdraw south and establish a new defensive line. He had maps. He had a plan. He had already scouted the position. The order came back. Hold your current position until relieved. Relief never came. Japanese forces attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. Hunt was shot through the chest early in the engagement. He died in the same building he'd been ordered to hold, bleeding out on a floor littered with empty shell casings while his men fought around his body. Subedar Joginder Singh, 15th Punjab Regiment, Indian Army. He commanded a platoon holding a position on the northwest coast. When Japanese forces landed nearby, Singh's platoon was among the first to engage them. For 4 hours, they held the beach against wave after wave of Japanese troops. Singh was wounded twice but refused evacuation. When ammunition ran low, he led a bayonet charge. He was killed in that charge. His platoon held that stretch of beach for 36 hours before being overrun. Of 45 men, 8 survived. Singh was later awarded the Param Veer Chakra, India's highest military honor, but no honor could change the fact that his sacrifice achieved nothing. The beach was lost. The position was lost. The island was lost. Men died because the Doctrine demanded they die in place rather than live to fight from better positions. These weren't cowards. These weren't men who broke and ran. These were professional soldiers, many of them, veterans of campaigns in North Africa and Europe, men who understood that the position was hopeless, but followed orders anyway because military discipline demanded it. They died, not because the enemy was too strong, but because their own doctrine was inflexible. Aftermath. Did anyone learn? You would think Singapore's fall would have prompted a re-evaluation of stand-fast orders. It did not. In summer 1942, German Sixth Army advanced towards Stalingrad. By November, they were deep inside the city, fighting street by street, building by building. Then Soviet forces launched Operation Eurominus, a massive counterattack that encircled the German army. The pocket contained 290,000 German soldiers. They had supplies for perhaps 2 weeks. The situation was desperate, but not immediately hopeless. German forces could have attempted a breakout, fighting their way west to link up with other German armies. Many officers urged this. Field Marshal Paulus, commanding Sixth Army, requested permission to attempt a breakout. Hitler's response: hold Stalingrad, stand fast, no retreat. He promised an airlift would supply the pocket. The Luftwaffe tried. They failed. In the brutal winter of 1942-1943, trapped German soldiers starved, froze, and died by the thousands. On February 2, 1943, the survivors surrendered. Of 290,000 men encircled, approximately 90,000 went into Soviet captivity. Of those, fewer than 5,000 ever returned to Germany. Hitler's stand-fast order at Stalingrad achieved nothing. It didn't save the city. It didn't tie down Soviet forces. The Soviets were perfectly happy to let Germans starve in the pocket, while Red Army units continued advancing elsewhere. It destroyed an entire army and eliminated Germany's best chance of stabilizing the southern front. And yet Hitler continued issuing identical orders throughout the war. Fortresses that must be held at all costs, positions that cannot be abandoned, cities that must be defended to the last man. In spring 1944, Soviet forces encircled German Army Group Center in Belarus. The pocket contained 300,000 men. Hitler's order: hold in place. The result: the destruction of Army Group Center, the single greatest German defeat of the entire war. In autumn 1944, German forces retreated into fortified positions along the Scheldt estuary in Belgium. Hitler's order: these are fortresses. They will be held. The result: 41,000 German soldiers trapped and eventually forced to surrender in positions that couldn't be supplied or reinforced. The pattern was identical every time: encirclement, stand-fast order, destruction. And yet the doctrine never changed. Not because German military leadership was incompetent. German officers understood the problem, but because Hitler personally intervened in tactical decisions, and his word was law. To suggest retreat was to risk execution, so officers followed orders, and men died. The Soviets had their own disasters. In 1942, attempting to recapture Kharkov, Red Army forces drove deep into German lines. German forces counterattacked and threatened to encircle the entire offensive. Soviet commanders requested permission to withdraw. Stalin's order: continue attacking. The result: approximately 270,000 Soviet soldiers killed or captured in a battle that never needed to happen. If Soviet forces had withdrawn when encirclement became apparent, they could have saved the army for future operations. Instead, Stalin's refusal to authorize retreat turned a temporary setback into a catastrophe. Even Western Allied forces occasionally fell into the same trap. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces surrounded the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. The division's acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, famously replied, "Nuts," to a German surrender demand. The story became legendary. American forces held Bastogne until relieved. But here's the difference. McAuliffe had supplies. He had defensible terrain. He had artillery support. And he had reliable intelligence that relief forces were coming. Most importantly, he had the authority to surrender if the situation became untenable. His superiors told him to hold if possible, but the decision was ultimately his. That's the critical distinction. Tactical flexibility. The authority to make decisions based on the situation on the ground, rather than orders issued hundreds of miles away by commanders who didn't understand the reality. Broader patterns, when stand-fast orders worked and when they didn't. The question military historians have debated for decades is this: were stand-fast orders always wrong, or did they sometimes achieve their intended purpose? The answer is complicated. There were situations where holding at all costs made sense. Moscow in 1941 is one example. Leningrad, under siege for 872 days, is another. The Soviet Union poured immense resources into holding Leningrad, resources that might have been better used elsewhere. But the symbolic and psychological importance of the city justified the cost. If Leningrad had fallen, Soviet morale might have collapsed. Stalingrad is more ambiguous. The city had symbolic importance. It bore Stalin's name. But the strategic importance was its position on the Volga River. Holding Stalingrad tied down German forces and prevented them from advancing into the Caucasus oil fields. The question is whether the city needed to be held at the cost of an entire army. Could a mobile defense, trading space for time, have achieved the same strategic result with lower casualties? Many historians argue it could have. The stand-fast orders that clearly failed were the ones issued for positions of no strategic value, defended for purely symbolic reasons or because doctrine demanded it. Singapore had no strategic value once the Malayan Peninsula fell. It was a symbol, an important symbol, but losing it 2 weeks earlier versus 2 weeks later made no material difference to the course of the war. The tens of thousands of men captured there could have been evacuated to India or Australia, where they would have been invaluable for training new units and fighting in later campaigns. The Courland Pocket is another example. In 1944, German Army Group North was trapped in Latvia's Courland Peninsula by advancing Soviet forces. Hitler ordered them to hold. For 9 months, 200,000 German soldiers sat in the Courland Pocket, fighting off repeated Soviet attacks, achieving nothing. They surrendered in May 1945, when the war ended. Those 200,000 men could have been evacuated by sea and used to defend Germany itself. But Hitler's obsession with holding ground meant they wasted away in a strategic dead end. The pattern across all these examples is clear. Stand-fast orders worked when they served a clear strategic purpose, and when the position could actually be held with available resources. They failed catastrophically when issued for symbolic reasons or when commanders far from the battlefield refused to acknowledge tactical reality. Other theaters, same tragedy, the Pacific and North Africa. Before we examine how these orders were codified, let's look at how the same deadly doctrine played out in other theaters of war, because Singapore was far from the only example. In the Philippines, December 1941 through May 1942, American and Filipino forces faced a similar situation. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces invaded Luzon. General Douglas MacArthur's war plan called for defending the beaches, holding the invasion at the shoreline. The plan was called War Plan Orange 3, and it was obsolete before the first shot was fired. MacArthur had 130,000 Filipino and American troops, but most were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and scattered across the islands. The Japanese landed with 43,000 veteran troops, complete air superiority, and naval dominance. MacArthur should have immediately withdrawn to the Bataan Peninsula, a defensible position where he could have consolidated his forces. Instead, he ordered beach defenses. Units were scattered along hundreds of miles of coastline, exactly the wrong strategy against an enemy with mobility and air power. The beach defenses collapsed in days. When MacArthur finally ordered withdrawal to Bataan, he'd lost critical supplies and equipment that could have been saved. But the real disaster came later. By April 1942, American and Filipino forces on Bataan were starving, out of ammunition, ravaged by malaria and dysentery. The Japanese had them surrounded. No relief was coming. MacArthur had already been evacuated to Australia on President Roosevelt's orders, though he'd wanted to stay. His replacement, General Jonathan Wainwright, requested permission to surrender. Washington's response: fight to the last man. Roosevelt didn't want the symbolism of an American surrender. The War Department understood the strategic reality. Bataan was lost, the Philippines were lost, but the political cost of authorized surrender seemed too high. Wainwright disobeyed. On April 9, 1942, he surrendered Bataan without explicit authorization. Approximately 76,000 Filipino and American troops went into captivity. What followed was the Bataan Death March, a 65-mile forced march in tropical heat without food or water. Japanese guards bayoneted or shot anyone who fell behind. Approximately 10,000 men died on that march. Another 16,000 died in the following months in prisoner-of-war camps. Could earlier surrender have prevented the death march? Probably not. The Japanese brutality was not a function of when surrender occurred. But could an earlier, authorized withdrawal from the Philippines have saved those men entirely? Could they have been evacuated to Australia before the Japanese tightened the noose? Military historians debate this, but what's clear is that Roosevelt's insistence on fighting to the last man prolonged suffering without achieving any military objective. In North Africa, similar patterns emerged. At Tobruk in 1942, British forces held the port city under siege from April through November 1941. The defense of Tobruk was strategically important because it prevented Axis forces from advancing into Egypt. The siege succeeded because the Royal Navy could resupply the garrison by sea, and because the German and Italian forces besieging Tobruk lacked the strength to assault it directly. But in 1942, Tobruk fell in a single day. Why? Because strategic circumstances had changed. Rommel's Africa Corps was stronger, better supplied. The British garrison was weaker, less experienced, and critically, Churchill insisted Tobruk be held at all costs, repeating the same mistake he'd made at Singapore. He saw Tobruk as a symbol, a fortress that must not fall. On June 21, 1942, after less than 24 hours of fighting, the Tobruk garrison surrendered. 35,000 British and Commonwealth troops marched into captivity. The fall of Tobruk was one of the British Army's greatest defeats of the war, and it happened because Churchill's insistence on holding the position prevented commanders from withdrawing to defensible lines further east. The commander who surrendered Tobruk, Major General Hendrik Klopper, was vilified in the British press. He was called a coward, accused of surrendering prematurely. But post-war analysis showed that Klopper had no choice. His garrison lacked the supplies, the fortifications, and the artillery support to hold against Rommel's assault. If he'd fought longer, he would simply have gotten more men killed before the inevitable surrender. Churchill's stand-fast order had created a situation where Klopper could either surrender prematurely and preserve his men's lives, or fight honorably until the garrison was annihilated. He chose surrender, and historians now acknowledge he made the right decision. These examples share common features. Political leaders far from the battlefield insisting positions be held for symbolic reasons. Military commanders on the ground, understanding the position is hopeless, and men dying in the gap between political symbolism and tactical reality. The Eastern Front, a catalogue of encirclements. The Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945 was where rigid defensive doctrine killed the most men. The scale of the fighting, the distances involved, and the uncompromising nature of both Hitler and Stalin created perfect conditions for catastrophic stand-fast orders. In summer 1941, German forces encircled Soviet armies repeatedly. At Minsk, 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. At Smolensk, another 300,000. At Kiev, the encirclement trapped 665,000 Red Army troops, the largest encirclement in military history. In each case, Stalin's insistence that positions be held regardless of circumstances turned tactical defeats into annihilations. Soviet commanders who requested permission to retreat were accused of defeatism or cowardice. General Dmitry Pavlov, commanding the Western Front, when the Germans invaded, was arrested, tried for treason, and executed after his armies were encircled at Minsk. The message to other Soviet commanders was clear: lose your army through encirclement, and you might survive captivity. Order a retreat to save your army, and you'll be shot. This created perverse incentives. Soviet commanders learned to wait too long before requesting permission to withdraw, hoping the situation would improve or that Stalin would authorize retreat before encirclement became complete. By the time permission came, if it came at all, it was usually too late. The pattern reversed after 1942. As the Red Army grew stronger and German forces weakened, it was German units facing encirclement, and Hitler's response was identical to Stalin's. No retreat, hold at all costs. The position will be relieved. At Korsun-Cherkasy in January 1944, 60,000 German soldiers were encircled. Hitler ordered them to hold and wait for relief. Some units broke out on their own initiative, but approximately 20,000 were killed or captured because they followed Hitler's order to hold in place. At Kolm, at Demyansk, at Velikie Luki, the pattern repeated. German forces encircled, Hitler ordering them to hold, some garrisons relieved at enormous cost, others destroyed. Each time, German casualties were multiplied because forces that could have conducted fighting withdrawals were instead trapped in pockets and forced to fight with dwindling supplies until death or surrender. The psychological impact of these disasters on both armies was immense. Soviet soldiers learned that surrendering meant probable death in German prison camps, but retreating meant certain death from NKVD blocking detachments. Better to die fighting. German soldiers learned that their leadership would abandon them in hopeless positions, ordering them to die for symbolic reasons while senior officers escaped by air. The deadly rule. Codified, not one step back and fortress orders. Now let's examine the specific orders that codified this doctrine, because understanding the exact language helps explain why so many men died. Stalin's Order number 227, not one step back, issued July 28, 1942, is one of the most infamous military orders in history. The full text ran several pages, but the key passages were these. Panic makers and cowards must be liquidated on the spot, not one step back. This must be our watchword from now on. The retreat mentality must be decisively eliminated. Army commanders who have allowed the voluntary abandonment of positions must be removed from their posts and sent to higher headquarters for trial by military tribunal. The order established blocking detachments of 200 men per division, positioned behind Soviet lines with machine guns, and explicit orders to shoot anyone retreating without permission. It established penal battalions, Strafbats, where soldiers accused of cowardice or unauthorized retreat would be sent to perform the most dangerous assault missions, survive 3 missions, and your record was cleared. Most didn't survive 1. The psychological impact of Order 227 was exactly what Stalin intended. Soviet soldiers knew that retreating meant death from their own side. Better to die attacking the Germans than to be shot by NKVD troops. The order stabilized Soviet lines during the desperate fighting of summer and fall 1942. It also killed tens of thousands of men who could have retreated to defensible positions and lived to fight again. Hitler's fortress orders were similar in intent, but different in implementation. Hitler didn't establish blocking detachments. He didn't need to. German military culture emphasized obedience. When Hitler designated a city or position as a fortress to be held at all costs, German officers obeyed. The first fortress order came in December 1941, but Hitler formalized the system in March 1944, issuing specific orders designating dozens of cities across occupied Europe as fortresses. These fortresses were supposed to tie down enemy forces, force the Allies or Soviets to conduct lengthy sieges, buy time for German armies to regroup. In practice, most fortresses fell quickly once surrounded, because they lacked the supplies, reinforcements, or fortifications to withstand a sustained siege. The men trapped in them died or marched into captivity, having accomplished nothing. Legacy and lessons. What modern military doctrine says. Modern military doctrine has learned, at least partially, from these disasters. The emphasis today is on mission-type orders, what the Germans called Auftragstaktik. Senior commanders define the mission's objective, but junior officers have wide latitude in how they accomplish it. If a position becomes untenable, company and battalion commanders have authority to withdraw to better ground without waiting for permission from higher headquarters. NATO doctrine explicitly states that defense in depth is preferable to linear defense. Rather than holding a single line at all costs, modern defensive doctrine emphasizes multiple fallback positions, mobile reserves, and the flexibility to trade space for time when necessary. The goal is to preserve combat power and destroy the enemy, not to hold specific terrain for symbolic reasons. But the lessons haven't been completely learned. In recent conflicts, we've seen echoes of the same rigid thinking. During the Iraq War, some coalition positions held longer than tactical sense dictated because pulling back would have been seen as defeat. In Afghanistan, remote outposts were maintained for years despite being indefensible and strategically irrelevant because abandoning them would have sent the wrong message. The fundamental tension remains. Military discipline requires obedience, but tactical effectiveness requires flexibility. How do you create an army that follows orders while also empowering junior leaders to make life or death decisions in real time? The men who died at Singapore, at Stalingrad, in the Courland pocket, and dozens of other forgotten encirclements, they followed orders. They did their duty. They stood fast when ordered to stand fast. Their deaths accomplished nothing because the orders themselves were flawed, issued by commanders who prioritized symbols over lives, who refused to acknowledge reality, who believed willpower could overcome tactical impossibility. The real cost, numbers that tell the story. Let's talk numbers, because the scale of this disaster needs to be quantified. Singapore, 80,000 captured, approximately 15,000 died in captivity. Stalingrad, 290,000 Germans encircled, fewer than 5,000 returned from Soviet captivity. Courland pocket, 200,000 German troops tied down for 9 months, surrendered en masse. Army Group Center, Belarus, 1944. 300,000 Germans encircled. The Army Group ceased to exist as a fighting force. Soviet losses from rigid defensive doctrine are harder to calculate because Soviet records were deliberately obscured, but conservative estimates suggest at least 500,000 Red Army soldiers were killed or captured in encirclements that could have been avoided with timely retreats during 1941-1942. These aren't just numbers. Each one represents a man who died because doctrine mattered more than life. A son who never came home. A father who never met his children. A husband whose wife waited years for news that never came. And what did these deaths accomplish? What strategic objective justified sacrificing these men? Singapore's fall gave Japan control of Southeast Asia, which they would have gained anyway. Holding the island 2 more weeks changed nothing. Stalingrad became a Soviet victory despite German stand-fast orders, not because of them. The fortresses fell. The defensive lines collapsed. The encircled armies surrendered. Men died by the hundreds of thousands, and the only thing their deaths accomplished was to temporarily delay the inevitable. The officers who issued these orders, Hitler, Stalin, Churchill in the case of Singapore, they survived the war. They wrote memoirs. They were studied by historians. The men who died following those orders are names on memorials, if they're remembered at all. Conclusion: the price of inflexibility. War demands sacrifice. Everyone understands this. Soldiers sign up knowing they might not come home. But there's a difference between necessary sacrifice and pointless waste. The men who died at Normandy, at Iwo Jima, in the Battle of Britain, they died accomplishing something. Their sacrifice had meaning. The Allies won those battles. Those positions needed to be taken or held. The men who died because of stand-fast orders, they died because military doctrine was inflexible. Because commanders, hundreds or thousands of miles from the battlefield, refused to accept that their orders no longer matched reality. Because retreat, even tactical retreat to better positions, was seen as defeat. Modern military forces tried to do better. They emphasize adaptability, flexibility, the importance of real-time decision-making. But the temptation remains, the belief that holding ground matters more than preserving lives, that withdrawal equals failure, that standing fast proves courage. It doesn't. The soldiers who died at Singapore and Stalingrad were brave. Their courage was never in question. What was in question was the wisdom of the men who ordered them to stand fast. And on that question, history's verdict is clear. The doctrine was flawed, the orders were wrong, and tens of thousands died who could have lived. We tell these stories not to shame the dead or diminish their sacrifice, but to remember that orders are only as good as the judgment behind them. That flexibility can be strength. That sometimes the most courageous decision is to acknowledge reality and act accordingly, even when that means going against doctrine, against tradition, against orders. The men who died deserved better. They deserved leaders who valued their lives as much as they valued symbols and territory. They deserved the chance to fight from defensible positions, to retreat when necessary, to live long enough to see victory. They didn't get that chance. And that's the real tragedy of the stand-fast order. Not that men died in war, that happens in every conflict, but that they died for nothing, following orders that accomplished nothing, sacrificing themselves to doctrine that served no strategic purpose. If this story has moved you, if you believe these men deserve to be remembered and their stories told, please subscribe to Override War. Every week we bring you comprehensive, researched stories from World War II. The human experiences that shaped the conflict, the decisions that changed lives, the doctrines that cost them. We don't just tell you what happened. We show you why it mattered and what it cost in human terms. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Tell us if your family had members who served, if you've heard similar stories, if there are other aspects of World War II you'd like us to explore. Are you watching from the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, Canada, India? Somewhere else entirely. Our community spans the globe, and every comment, every like, every share helps ensure these stories don't disappear into history's shadows. The men who died at Singapore and Stalingrad and in 100 other forgotten encirclements can't tell their stories anymore. We tell them instead. We remember them. We honor them not by pretending their deaths were glorious or necessary, but by acknowledging the truth. They died following orders that never should have been given, in defense of positions that never should have been held, sacrificed to a doctrine that valued ground over life. They deserved better. The least we can do is remember them truthfully. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for making sure these men are not forgotten. Subscribe, comment, and join us next time as we continue exploring the human stories of World War II.